The night my father handed me a manila envelope instead of a birthday card, I knew something had broken beyond repair. I was 22. My brother Caden had just turned 22 with me. We're twins. 11 months apart, in the way people always found confusing until they stopped asking. And we were standing in the foyer of a house I had lived in my entire life. The marble floors, the chandelier my mother picked out before she got sick, the smell of lemon polish and old money that I used to think was just what air smelled like. My father, Sterling Aldridge, did not look at me when he held out the envelope. He looked at the fireplace. "There's a cashier's check inside for $5,000, he said. "That's more than generous, more than I'm required to give." I looked at the envelope. I didn't take it. "Required," I repeated. He finally turned. His face was the face I'd grown up trying to read. Carved, deliberate, the kind of face that never gave anything away in a boardroom, or at a dinner table, or at a funeral. My mother's funeral, specifically 3 years earlier, where he had stood dry-eyed while I fell apart beside him. "The house, the accounts, the Aldridge Group, none of that concerns you anymore," he said. "You made your choices. I'm making mine." My choices. He meant the fact that I had refused to sign over control of a land trust my grandfather had set up in my name. A trust that my father's attorneys had been circling for 2 years, trying to fold into the corporate structure of Aldridge Group, the commercial real estate company my grandfather built, and my father had spent the better part of a decade quietly hollowing out. I had refused. Caden had refused. So this was the answer. Caden was standing behind me. I could hear him breathing. "Dad," he said, and there was still something in his voice. Something I didn't have anymore. Some last thread of hoping it was a mistake, that we'd misunderstood something. "You don't have to do this." My father picked up his glass of scotch from the side table. "Get out of my house," he said quietly. "Both of you." We drove for 2 hours before either of us said anything. It was November in Virginia, and the kind of cold that gets into the car no matter how high you run the heat. Caden was driving because I couldn't. My hands were shaking, in a way I couldn't explain to myself. Not from fear exactly, more like the way your body shakes after an accident, when the adrenaline has nowhere left to go. We ended up at a Waffle House off I-81. Caden ordered coffee, and I ordered coffee, and we sat across from each other in a booth with ripped vinyl seats and a paper placement advertising the local auto dealership, and we didn't talk for a long time. Finally, Caden said, "We have to call somebody." "Who?" He didn't answer, which meant he didn't know either. Our mother's sister lived in Phoenix and hadn't spoken to our father in 15 years. We had cousins I barely recognized. There was nobody in the Aldridge orbit we could go to. Those were our father's people, his lawyers and his board members and his golf partners, people who sent Christmas cards and came to our mother's funeral and would absolutely take his call over ours without blinking. Then Caden said, "Grandpa Noel's place." I looked up. Our grandfather, our mother's father, Noel Cresswell, had died the previous spring. He was 81, a retired land surveyor who had spent 40 years mapping rural Virginia and western West Virginia, and he had lived alone on a 12-acre property outside a town called Dunmore ever since our grandmother passed. We had visited him every summer as kids. He made terrible coffee and extraordinary biscuits, and he owned more topographic maps than any person reasonably needed, and I had loved him completely. He left the property to the two of us in his will. Our father's attorneys had tried to contest it and failed, which was one of the reasons the relationship had curdled the way it had. "The property's in probate," I said. "We can't even—" "The cabin isn't," Caden said. I stopped. There was something, a memory, the edge of a memory, of our grandfather, 2 Christmases ago, pulling me aside at the kitchen table after dinner while Caden was watching football with our dad. He had pressed something into my palm. A key, small and old, the kind with a round bow and 3 teeth. He had looked at me for a long moment. "That opens the storage building out back," he said. "The one with the green door. If you ever need to, you'll know." I had put it on my keychain. I had never once thought about it since. Until now, Dunmore, West Virginia is the kind of place that gets smaller every decade. The gas station doubles as the post office. The diner closes at 2 in the afternoon. The roads don't so much curve as they give up, winding into the mountains with the resigned quality of something that never planned to go anywhere in particular. We drove through the night. Caden slept for an hour somewhere past Staunton, and I drove in the dark with the radio on low and thought about my grandfather. Noel Cresswell was not a complicated man on the surface. He surveyed land. He kept his records. He ate supper at 5:30 and was in bed by 9. He went to the same Methodist church for 60 years. He didn't talk much about his feelings, and neither did we, and we understood each other perfectly because of that, in the way that some people just fit together without requiring explanation. But I was starting to wonder what else he had understood, quietly. Over the years he watched our family from the outside. He had never liked my father. He had never said so directly. He wasn't built for that kind of directness. But I could feel it in the way he went careful and still whenever my father's name came up, the way a surveyor goes still when he's measuring something that doesn't quite add up. By the time we turned onto the gravel road that led to his property, it was just past 4 in the morning. The headlights swept across frozen grass and bare oak trees and the dark shape of the main house, locked and waiting for probate to close. We parked and got out, and I stood in the cold for a moment listening to the silence. Out here, silence is a real thing. It has weight and texture. It settles on you. Caden came around the car and stood beside me. "Storage buildings out back," I said. We took the flashlights from the emergency kit in the trunk and walked around the side of the house, through the gate that still hung crooked, the same way it had hung crooked since I was 8 years old, out into the back property. The building was maybe 20 by 30 feet, wood-sided with a metal roof, and it had a green door that had faded over the years to something closer to gray-green, the color of lichen on stone. There was a padlock on the hasp, heavy duty, the kind that doesn't rust. I took the key off my keychain. My hands were still cold. I could feel Caden behind me, not saying anything, which was exactly right. The key turned. The building was a surveyor's storage space, metal shelving along 3 walls, labeled banker's boxes, rolled tubes of maps, a steel drafting table, a surveyor's transit in its original case. Everything organized the way my grandfather organized everything, which was to say obsessively and with a system that would only make sense to him. But on the drafting table, there was an envelope, white, letter-sized, not sealed. My name on the front in my grandfather's handwriting, the careful, deliberate penmanship of a man who had spent decades writing field notes. I picked it up. Inside was a single handwritten letter, 3 pages, and a small brass key taped to the top of the first page. The key had a piece of tape on it with 2 words in my grandfather's hand. "Floor safe." I read the letter standing at the drafting table with Caden reading over my shoulder. My grandfather's handwriting didn't rush. Even in a letter like this, with everything it contained, his penmanship was the same as always, measured, evenly spaced, the letters sitting on the line like they were placed there individually. He started by saying he was sorry he hadn't told me any of this in person. He said he had started to, several times, and found he couldn't get the words in the right order. He said some things were easier to write. Then he told me about my father. Not the version I knew, the composed, controlled man in the good suits, but a different version, one that my grandfather had been quietly assembling from the outside for the better part of a decade. The Aldridge Group had started as a legitimate commercial real estate operation. My grandfather knew this, had watched it grow during my parents' marriage with a kind of wary respect. But sometime around 8 years back, around the time my mother first got sick, which he noted without editorializing, the company had begun taking on investors whose origins were difficult to trace. Shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada, some with roots that led, if you followed them long enough, to private equity arrangements with a firm called Crestline Capital Partners, which itself had been of an SEC preliminary inquiry that was quietly dropped in 2019. My grandfather had noticed because he noticed everything, and because he still had friends in county assessor offices across 3 states from his surveying days. And because two of the properties that Aldridge Group acquired in a single 18-month window had previously been the subject of IRS liens that were resolved under circumstances his contacts described as unusual. He had kept records, copies of public filings, a ledger, his own, cross-referenced and dated, of every transaction he had been able to document. Photographs of physical documents he had obtained legally, a recorded phone call. He explained this carefully, noting that Virginia is a one-party consent state. Between my father and a man named Drayden Cross, who was the managing partner of Crestline, in which they discussed the transfer of a property in Roanoke County, in terms that, as my grandfather put it, did not sound like legal business. All of it was in the floor safe. The floor safe was under the drafting table, beneath a section of rubber mat. Caden found it while I was still reading. I want to tell you what it felt like to open that safe, but the honest answer is that I don't entirely remember. I remember Caden's face in the flashlight, pale, focused, the way he looks when he's concentrated on something that matters. I remember the smell of the building, cold metal and old paper, and something faintly mineral, like the maps themselves. I remember my own breathing. The safe held a fireproof document box and a sealed envelope with the words attorney. Do not open without counsel in my grandfather's handwriting. Inside the document box was everything he had described. The ledger, the copied filings, a USB drive in a small Ziploc bag labeled audio, Drayden Cross Sterling Aldridge, March 14. A set of handwritten notes in my grandfather's careful script, organized chronologically, each entry dated, some with asterisks and annotations in the margin. I sat down on the cold concrete floor and I read. Caden sat across from me and read. We were there for almost 2 hours. What my grandfather had documented was not small. The shell company arrangements, the acquisition patterns, the Crestline connection. Taken together, they pointed toward something that people who understand these things would call money laundering, though I didn't use that word yet, not that night, because the word felt too large and too final, and I wasn't ready. What I was ready for, sitting on that floor in the dark, was the realization that my father hadn't just cut us out of his life to protect his company. He had cut us out because we were the only people, besides my grandfather, who had standing to ask the questions he didn't want asked. The land trust. Of course, the land trust wasn't just a financial asset he wanted to fold into Aldridge Group. It was a legal exposure. If we controlled it independently, with our own counsel, we could end up in places he couldn't manage. So he solved the problem the way Sterling Aldridge solved most problems. He made us go away. We drove back to Virginia the next morning. Different from how we'd arrived, quieter, or maybe not quieter, exactly, more like the silence had changed quality, from the silence of shock to something steadier and more deliberate. Caden called a law school friend of his, a woman named, I'll just call her our attorney, because that's what she became, who specialized in corporate litigation. He had her on the phone for 40 minutes while I drove. I watched his face. He wasn't panicked. Caden doesn't panic in the way other people panic. He goes very focused and very still, like our grandfather. Our attorney met us that afternoon at her office in Charlottesville. She was careful and thorough, the kind of person who asks the same question 3 different ways because she wants to see if the answer changes. It didn't. She reviewed the ledger, the filings, the USB drive. We listened to the recording together in her office, and the room got very quiet. When it was done, she sat back in her chair. This is significant, she said. I want to be careful about what I tell you right now, because I'm still processing what I've seen. But I can tell you that what's on this recording, in combination with the documentation, is something that federal prosecutors look for. Specifically, I'd be thinking about the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. And I'd be thinking about whether your grandfather's attorney's envelope should be opened with FBI present. Is that what you recommend? I asked. She looked at me directly. I think your grandfather spent a long time putting this together for a reason, she said, Bide. I think we should honor that. The process took 7 weeks. I won't pretend they were easy weeks. We were staying in a rented room above a hardware store in Charlottesville, the 2 of us. in a space about the size of a large closet, with a shared bathroom down the hall and a window that looked out on the parking lot. We had the $5,000 from the envelope my father had handed me. I had taken it after all, in the end, standing in that foyer. Not because I wanted it, because I thought we might need it. We did. There were days I couldn't sleep. There were days I walked for hours without going anywhere in particular, through neighborhoods I didn't know, past houses where people were living ordinary lives that felt very far from mine. There were days I wondered if we had made the wrong call, if this was too big, if we were too small. Caden was the one who kept us moving. He has always been like that. Where I turn inward, he turns outward. Where I get stuck, he finds the next thing to do. He called our mother's sister in Phoenix. He applied for emergency assistance through a legal aid organization that helped us with some of the immediate costs. He found a food bank 2 miles from the hardware store and came home one evening with a box of groceries like it was nothing. Like he wasn't humiliated, like he had just decided to be practical instead. I never told him how much that mattered. I should have. Our attorney was working quietly with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Virginia. My grandfather's sealed envelope, opened in the presence of federal investigators, contained a notarized summary of his methodology, a chain of custody document for all the materials in the safe, and a letter addressed to whoever opened it, stating that the contents were gathered legally, retained in good faith, and donated to the pursuit of justice on behalf of his grandchildren. He had thought of everything. The man who made terrible coffee and extraordinary biscuits and went to the same church for 60 years had spent the last decade of his life quietly building a case that prosecutors described, later, as unusually well organized for a non-lawyer. I found out about the arrests the same way most people find out about things now. From my phone, early on a Thursday morning, before I was fully awake. My father had given a speech the night before at the Virginia Commercial Real Estate Association annual gala. I know this because it was in the Richmond Times-Dispatch that morning, sandwiched between the account of the speech and the account of what happened after. He had spoken for 20 minutes about the Aldridge Group's portfolio expansion, about opportunity in the mid-Atlantic market, about his vision for the next decade. Then federal agents had met him in the parking garage. Drayden Cross, the Crestline managing partner, was arrested the same morning at his home in McLean. 2 other individuals connected to the arrangement were taken into custody in the days that followed. I sat on the edge of the bed in that room above the hardware store and read the article twice, and then put my phone face down on the mattress and didn't move for a while. Caden knocked on my door and came in and sat on the floor with his back against the wall, which is how he's been sitting when we need to talk since we were kids. "You okay?" he said. "I don't know," I said. "Yeah," he said. "Me neither." We sat like that for a while. Outside, the parking lot was doing its ordinary morning things. Cars pulling in, a delivery truck backing up with its warning beep. "He's going to say we did this to him," I said finally. "Probably," Caden said. "And some people are going to believe him." "Some people always believe the version that feels more comfortable," Caden said. "That's not something we can fix." He was right. It didn't make it easier, but he was right. The legal process moved the way legal processes move, slowly, with long stretches of silence punctuated by bursts of information that required immediate decisions. Our attorney was honest with us about the timeline, about the uncertainty, about the things that could go differently than we hoped. What she was also honest about was the whistleblower provisions. I had not thought about this in those early weeks, had not thought about the financial side of what came from providing information that led to a successful federal financial crimes prosecution. She explained it carefully, the way she explained everything, methodically and without drama. Under the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network's program, cooperating individuals who provided substantial assistance to a successful enforcement action could be eligible for a portion of the recovery. The amounts varied. It depended on what was ultimately prosecuted and what was recovered. "I want you to understand this isn't guaranteed," she said. And it won't be fast. But it's real, and it's something your grandfather likely knew about when he put this together. I thought about that, about my grandfather at his kitchen table, or in that storage building, cross-referencing his dates, updating his ledger, thinking it through the way a surveyor thinks anything through, methodically, accounting for all the variables, building toward a conclusion he could stand behind. He had known. Of course he had known. He had known we would need resources when this was over, not just justice. The plea agreement came 11 months after the arrests. My father pleaded guilty to 2 counts of financial fraud and 1 count of conspiracy in connection with the Crestline arrangement. The sentencing guidelines called for significant prison time. He received 8 years. His attorneys argued for less. The judge noted the scale of the scheme, the duration, and the deliberate steps taken to insulate it from scrutiny, including, this was in the judge's statement, actions taken to remove potential witnesses from positions where they might have had standing to investigate. Caden read that line to me over the phone. I was outside, standing in a parking lot in Charlottesville. Different parking lot, different day, but the same kind of ordinary life continuing around me. Actions taken to remove potential witnesses, Caden said. That's us. Yeah, I said. He knew what he was doing to us. I know. There was a pause. Grandpa knew too, Caden said. That's why he built the exit. I don't live in Virginia anymore. Neither does Caden. We used some of the whistleblower recovery. It came through 14 months after the plea, and our attorney had prepared us for the number, without quite preparing us for the feeling of seeing it, which was not the feeling I expected. Not triumph. More like something settling into place, something that had been tilted returning to level. The Cresswell property in Dunmore came out of probate and is ours now. We've kept it. I drive out there sometimes when I need the particular kind of silence that place offers. The storage building has a new padlock. I have the key. I stood in there last fall, in October when the maples were turning, looking at the empty shelving and the drafting table and the floor where Caden and I sat for 2 hours reading everything our grandfather had given us. The floor safe is still there. Empty, now, obviously, but there. I keep the letter, the 3 pages in my grandfather's careful handwriting, the letters sitting on the line like they were placed there individually. I've read it so many times I have most of it memorized. But I read it again anyway. The way you return to certain things, not because you've forgotten them, but because you need the reminder of who knew you and thought about you, and quietly built something for you to stand on when the ground gave way. The greatest thing Noel Cresswell left us wasn't the property or the recovery or even the documentation, though we needed all of it. It was the proof, the undeniable, carefully notarized, impeccably organized proof that someone had seen what was happening and refused to let it stand, that he had looked at who we were and decided our lives were worth protecting. My father had a saying he used in business meetings, something about the difference between the people who build things and the people who inherit them. He meant it as a compliment to himself. I think about it differently now. My grandfather built something. He built it quietly, over years, in a storage building on 12 acres in West Virginia, and he left it for us to find when we needed it. He didn't have shareholders. He didn't have a board. He had a ledger and a key, and a belief that what was true would eventually matter more than what was powerful. He was right. No wall is too high to see over if someone who loves you has already found the footing.